Hello and welcome to my friend the Rainbow Circle. This is my co-host, Dino Spike, whose adorableness is here to mitigate anything mean I might say about Anne Lamott. I might have said on a previous episode that Bird by Bird would have been the worst book written or published. I'm sure there's books written. Would have been the worst book published if Stephen King hadn't published On Writing. Which is mean. I'm sorry. Um, so I wanted to explain that a little bit more. Serendipitously, I accidentally found a copy of Anne Lamott's essay, the title of which I won't allow myself to say because I'm Southern and a third child and a Pisces, so I feel bad when I say mean things, and also I am not going to say swear words um, on YouTube. Also, this is for my grandkids, so don't say swear words, grandkids. So I'll explain using that essay what I actually mean by that. Because I forgot most of the book, but now accidentally finding this essay in a stack of papers reminds me of what I disliked about that book. Um, but my older brother Bill, I'm a third child, my oldest brother Bill, is a videographer, and he recommended I keep these videos short, so I'm going to keep this short. That was a good recommendation, and here's why it was a good recommendation. It's a magnificent recommendation because he's a marketing genius, but here's why that was a good recommendation. For this particular format, YouTube videos, recognition of a very particular audience, viewers of YouTube videos, um, that's a recognition of the form that is optimal for YouTube video. He said 5 minutes. I don't know if I can do that. These are topics that I love, and I never, ever, 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 ever get to talk about them, so I go a bit overboard. And also, my audience is probably actually only my grandkids, or just a purely imaginary audience that doesn't actually exist. So that gives me carte blanche to not care that much about who my actual audience is. He's thinking of it from a marketing perspective of building an audience. To build an audience, I would keep it at 5 minutes, and I'm already halfway through now. But, I don't have enough of a particular type of confidence to believe that's even possible. I can pray and hope and pray and what have you, but I doubt. I don't see that as a realistic possibility, really. But I do want to explain what I dislike so much about Bird by Bird. And all books of that kind. I mean, I say it's the second worst ever published, but maybe John Gardner's book fits there. I don't know. A lot of the books whose writers I've totally forgot might fit there. I've read a bunch of them, and they've all been just terrible. Um, but I remember specifically, Stephen King's was the worst. Um, Bird by Bird might have been the second or third worst, maybe after John Gardner's. I just don't remember the authors of them because they gave me nothing valuable. It's like I don't remember a lot of the specific content of Anne Lamott's book because I found none of it valuable, even minimally. So I ejected a lot of it. But I affirm people who do find it valuable. It's kind of like the scientist who discovered, I meant to look this up, but the scientist who discovered the structure of benzodrine had a dream about an Ouroboros. And having this dream about the Ouroboros inspired him to figure out the structure of the benzodrine. That's great inspiration, but would I ever say, thankfully the Ouroboros existed as a symbol, otherwise we couldn't progress with science. So just being inspirational doesn't mean it's intrinsically a valuable book with actual content. But that's part of the problem I have with a lot of those types of books is overt fixation on good and bad. I know. I mean, see, that's part of the hypocrisy of saying it's one of the worst books ever published. Anytime I say something is good or bad, it's there's a significant amount of subjectivity involved in that, of course. Um, so on the purely subjective level, if you found it inspirational, it's entirely useful to you. Um, but just the whole idea of an objective good or bad, or treating good and bad as even relevant things. So that's a starting point of explaining why it's a problem. Um, but she has an essay, Anne Lamott. She seems like a, she's very charming. She seems like a very nice person. This is why I feel really guilty for attacking her. I'm not really attacking her. I just don't think her book is very responsible, or has good content. But she has one. She has an essay called "Crappy First Drafts." Let's call that essay. And I know a lot of people who love that essay. It's falling. I know a lot of people who love that essay, and I affirm people's love for it. Um, One of the things I love to, speaking of crappy first drafts, one of the things I obsess over is videos deconstructing everything that's bad about 50 Shades of Grey and all the 50 Shades of Grey books and movies and what have you. Not because I've never read them and I'm not going to read them, but it's not because I don't obsess over those videos because I am agreeing with them necessarily, but it's just interesting to see how people identify their particular likes and dislikes, and it's entirely subjective. Like those likes and dislikes, those likes and dislikes. I accidentally got relevantly lascivious, but it's interesting to see how people break down their likes and dislikes. There's no objectivity involved; those are all purely subjective. Um, but seeing how they break them down, that whole idea. I mean, this is another subject for another day. But a lot about 50 Shades of Grey seems like a bad first draft. But that being said, there are tons of people who, on an entirely valid level, love those books, and there's nothing wrong with that. And that was always my problem with trashing Twilight and things like that. It's entirely valid to love those books. There is no objective bad about them. So for us to call them bad says our opinion is intrinsically more valuable than someone else's opinion, which is just a non-starter. It's an elitist position, but it's just a very, very common elitist position. And that's one of the points I was trying to make about Birdemic. Birdemic, in so many ways, seems like the easiest example of an objectively bad movie. But to both have the consciousness to both recognize why it would be considered bad, but also the consciousness to recognize why someone would legitimately love it, helps exercise. I would say it's good for exercising the muscle, but it doesn't arrive at any sort of objectivity of good and bad. So, tons of people love that book and that particular essay. But I think the problem with it is the same sort of problem that you have with any sort of instructions about writing. I'm already almost at 10 minutes. I need a lot of practice at getting this down to 5 or 10 minutes. So I'll try to stay focused. This is what you might call a crappy first draft for a video. And I own that. I don't mind that one bit. But here's the basic problem is what Anne Lamott is actually identifying in that essay is growing recognition of your own value system. So what she calls a crappy first draft is really recognition of what she personally considers crappy. But also recognition of the need to practice in order to bring out what is good about a story, whatever kind of story you're writing. but there's no objectivity to the crappy first draft. So what she's actually talking about is exercising the capacity to recognize the subconscious processes, and it comes with any sort of art form. So if you're playing music, I have the TV on and it's playing music right now. If you're playing music, you play and you play and you play until it just comes automatically. So structurally, it works a bit different for a story because it always might come in the form of multiple bad first drafts. But multiple bad first drafts is like multiple bad practices with a song. If you become an expert at the expert level, this is my fixation on 10,000 hoursing. Doesn't have to be 10,000 hours specifically, but practicing to such a degree that a good first draft comes automatically. But more so, it's recognizing what the story is supposed to be. So it's like Michelangelo. Uh, it's sort of the inverse of the Hitler fallacy, I guess. But it's like Michelangelo said, the sculpture's inside the marble. He's just bringing it out. That's because he's such an expert at sculpture. He's able to recognize the story that's inside of the marble, the image inside of the marble. So the first draft might be cutting off a slab of marble, but through practice you're recognizing the genuine story or essay or whatever that's inside of that marble. And that's what she's recognizing in crappy first drafts. But what happens with these story and writing instruction things is there's no ability to dictate what that actually means. What does crappy mean? What does a good story actually mean? So by necessity, they have to make it vague. And so it's the same intrinsic problem as saying a good writer reads. You can't really make that specific enough to actually legitimately be helpful because of the variety of different genres. So it slips into inadvertent elitism of literary fiction versus genre fiction, for example. It's so vague as to cover everything, but in actual practice, it ends up being elitist. So seemingly affirmation of bad first drafts seems egalitarian, but in practice, it ends up turning into a sort of elitism. And so the positive, I would say the positive most people take from that essay is likely affirmation of their own practice. It's the same thing at the root of going to a reading and asking the writer, what is your actual routine? Because that superficial routine either becomes a placebo for, you can follow this routine that somebody else has, and through placebo effect, it makes you feel like you're improving, when probably you're actually improving because of continued experience of writing. It's that same sort of superficial, outward in sort of practice of writing where you think that affirmation of the practice of writing bad first drafts gives you license to do that so that you're not overly self-conscious. And that has a tremendous amount of value, but there's no sort of universal wisdom behind it necessarily. The universal wisdom is actually disregarding false objectivity about good and bad and gaining access to your own concept of good and bad. And through practice, continuous practice, understanding what the story is inside of the uncarved marble, not that there is a universal good or bad that you're really aiming for, but there is something true to the story that you're aiming for. And it's entirely possible to get that right on the first try. and that's entirely subjective and personal. So, and Lamont recommends, multiple first drafts, but if you get it right on the first draft, it's as equally valid. And that might mean that you accidentally stumbled onto it, or that might mean that you've practiced the art so many times that, like a well practiced musician, you're able to get the song right on the first try. And a lot of people will do that. Um, there's a Malcolm Gladwell podcast where he compares Bob Dylan's writing process to Leonard Cohen's writing process, which is, some people can produce, great songs without much effort, and some people just have to revise over and over and over again. Those are different processes. It doesn't mean one's better than the other. It's a highly personalized. Through the actual writing process, you recognize which one you are, and so it might take infinite bad first drafts, or you might be able to just pump them out. And that's kind of the irony of reading Stephen King's irresponsible and terrible book. If you say crappy first drafts, and something that needs a lot of editing, a lot of his books seem that way, but they're beloved and they work just fine. So you can read a Stephen King novel and say, this seems like a first draft that has tons of stuff that should have been cut out. And yet he's still strangely recommending a lot of these cliches about efficiency. Doesn't make any sense. And, one of the worst lines ever published is when Stephen King says, Ernest Hemingway said, "Kill your darlings," and he was right, which is wrong on so many levels, but partly it's wrong because he doesn't really do that either, seemingly. So don't kill your darlings. That's a terrible, terrible, terrible advice. You might have, what people identify as darlings. Through a crappy first draft, you might have something that you really like, but through practice and understanding what the story actually needs, you can recognize that this particular darling is an ineffective thing to retain in the story. Let me eliminate that in order to enhance the other darlings, to understand what the actual darling is of the story. So, it's entirely up to personal experience, but through continuous practice, you can recognize your personal what your own value system is. This is almost 20 minutes. I need more practice. You see, this is my crappy first draft. And through practice, with a goal in mind of cutting this down to maybe 10 minutes, I can recognize instinctively where I need to shut things off. And this is my first attempt at shortening these videos. Not that much shorter, but I'll just go ahead and wrap it up. In other words, if you like Anne Lamott, feel free to like her, and that's entirely subjective. If you find inspiration from Bird by Bird, whatever. I wouldn't call it wisdom. I would just call it affirmation that somebody has similar viewpoints as you do. But I personally don't think it's a very responsible a collection of essays, and I find much of what she says offensive. However, I validate the whole idea that continuous practice gives you greater self-awareness of what you personally consider good and bad, and personally how long it will actually take you to figure out what the story is about, whether it is in one draft or 100 drafts. There's nothing wrong with increasing that self-awareness, but a model of just how many drafts you need is, entirely wrong-headed, if you ask me. But anyway, trying to end on a positive, I saw a lot of finches outside of this window today, and they were very pretty. Have a good day.